So just a few days ago, GitHub shipped the new product, Copilot, which is basically an AI model that helps programmers generate code faster and with less work. It's like having Stack Overflow or GitHub right in your IDE or autocomplete on steroids. The name Copilot is actually quite accurate because you're essentially having an AI pair programmer who's there to guide and facilitate the course of your project. It does this by understanding the context from both your comments as well as your code, which essentially means that Copilot needs to understand both programming and human languages. From this context, Copilot then suggests individual lines or even whole functions instantly. Maybe not instantly, but it's still rather fast in my opinion. So I'll break down this video into two parts. The first part is a demo of the use cases of Copilot. At the time of this video, the Copilot technical preview is available as a VS Code extension to only a limited number of test users, but thankfully I was lucky enough to actually get access to try it out. And then in the next part of the video, I hope to answer any of the questions you guys might have when seeing Copilot in action for the first time. I think like most people, whether you're a developer or not, you'd be curious about how this actually works, what are the limitations, and what does this all mean for developers, software development, and AI as a whole in general. Most of these answers are actually already available on the Copilot site, but I doubt many of you would actually scroll the way down to the bottom to read the FAQs. So before we get started with the demo, what can we actually use Copilot for? Well, Copilot is great for writing boilerplate code, auto-filling repetitive code patterns, and for writing tests. So I think some of the use cases that might be great for Copilot will be for generating quick prototypes, where you're more concerned about whether the code works, or if you're just trying to learn a new framework and you're trying to explore possibilities about how you can implement a certain function. Because it might be really helpful to have an easy way to just see other ways of accomplishing the same task, which may be more efficient or cleaner implementations that will ultimately result in you writing better code, and that's definitely a win for all of us. So let's start with a quick and simple example of calculating the days between dates. So open up a new file and select the language as JavaScript. And this is going to be a function that will calculate the days between dates. So I can just type in function calculate days between dates. And let's see, if we wait for a moment, we should get some suggestions. And there we have, if I press tab, you can see that we have the code written out for us. So this is a really quick way of getting your functions up and running. Another example you might try is to create a function using comments. So here you can type in a comment and say find all images, and you can see that if you pause for a moment you get some suggestions, but let's go with find all images without alternate text. So let's say you're making a website and give them a red border, and let's see, this time we get the function suggested to us, tab, and to keep getting suggestions you can press enter again and wait for a moment and press tab again. And so this process can be repeated if you keep pressing tab and enter. Another use case that Copilot is great for is for handling repetitive tasks. So let's say you have a new file, and let's go with Python this time, and say you want to import certain packages. So first I can go with something like import OS, and then import sys, press enter, import math. So these are the standard libraries that Python has. If I want a library that is not one of the standard libraries, for example Beautiful Soup, I can say from BS4, and without even having to Google what is the name of the library, I can just have it suggested to me. And if let's say I want to do some plotting with Matplotlib, then I can say import the plotting library, and let's see if it suggests the correct one. If there are no suggestions, you can always press Ctrl Enter, and that works as well. We can synthesize 10 solutions, and there we have import plotting library, we get import matplotlib.pyplot, and so this is the correct one that I was looking for, so I'll just accept it. Now let's try something a bit more advanced. Let's say we want to determine whether the sentiment of a text is positive or negative. So let's just go ahead and delete all of this and say, let me import requests to make requests, and oops, let's go with requests. And let's see, it's making suggestions based on what I've previously typed in this file, but since we're not going to do any web scraping, let's go with import JSON. And let's say we want a function that uses some web service to determine whether the sentiment of text is positive or negative. So I can say use a web service to determine whether the sentiment of a text is positive, and let's see what we get, or negative. So you realize that sometimes you might not get actual code that is being suggested, you might get another line of command that's being suggested. But in this case, let's see, we wait for a moment. If there are no suggestions, we can do Ctrl Enter, and let's see what solutions we can generate. Alright, so we have URL. So we can use the text processing API over here, which is what I would go for. But if let's say we want it in a function, so if I don't specify it as a function, then it's just going to suggest to me the code for the actual implementation. So let's say I want to define a function that uses, and let's see where we get to this time. And there we have, immediately we get the definition for a function. I can keep pressing tab, enter, hold up for a moment, use the Alchemy API this time. So let's try this. Press enter again, no suggestions. So sometimes it takes a while, maybe because of this quote. Press enter, then we have text, tab, tab, and we get request, response.json. And so this might be a bit tedious to keep pressing tab and enter, and frankly the whole point is just to automate this whole process. So to quickly get the rest of the suggestions, we can do control enter again, synthesize the solutions, and let's see what we have. So we can scroll through and see some of this, or most of this, are actually rather similar, and sometimes it's just the changing of the variable names or the API that you're using. And just note that these API keys are not going to be valid, so GitHub has some measures in place to make sure that no private data is being leaked. So not to worry about this. So let's say we go with, let's go with this example. And so this works. We do have an extra if statement, so let's go ahead and remove, or rather let's put this in here. The indentation is a bit off. Alright, so that was really fast. And now what I as a programmer have to do then is to check through the code and make sure that it is exactly what I want and make any adjustments to the code if necessary. So for example, you might change the API key or the URL over here, but other than that, the structure of the code is more or less what we want. And if we're ready, we can actually try and generate some dummy data. So let's say we want to have an array of, or a list of positive sentences. And so let me just scroll down so you can see, and there we have a suggestion. We can have an empty list, but let me just put in some dummy data. So let's say, I love this car, this view is amazing, this car is awesome. And then when we're done, we can actually close that bracket. And oops, close that bracket and go for negative sentences. So this is really great for generating dummy data on the fly without having to think of it on the spot. And you notice that just by naming your variables accurately, Copilot is able to suggest the sentences according to what you want. So for positive sentences, we get things like love, amazing, awesome. If I type in negative sentences, you can see that automatically we get suggestions that are more related to negativity. So I hate this car, let's see, this view is horrible, and this car is terrible. So let's say we go with these, and then at this point we can say print out the sentiments for each of the positive sentences. So we can say for sentence in positive sentences, we can print sentence and print get sentiment sentence. And so if you want to format this a bit, you can actually just go and change this according to what you prefer. So print sentence, we can say print the sentence followed by the sentiment. But of course, for things that are really simple, you might be better off just typing in, let's say for a sentence in negative sentences, you might not even need to type in the comment. You can just say it like this and then print the sentence followed by the sentiment of that sentence. And you notice that this formatting over here is taken into consideration based on the previous time that I formatted this. And just like that, we have a simple program that is able to generate sentiments for text using some web service or web API. Let's try a couple more examples. So let's say open up a new file and say, let's select Python again this time. Or maybe let's try Java. So let's go with Java and say, I want to do a binary search. Oops, sorry, let's do a binary search on a unsorted array. So let's go, and somehow it suggests to you an author. So if I do Control Enter, you can see the solutions it's actually generating. Currently there's only one, okay. Yeah, and we see a few other examples. At times it might suggest things like the author name, which is not very useful, like this. So that's because it's being trained on such data from GitHub or Stack Overflow. But you can always do Ctrl Enter and select the one that you want. So let's say binary search, and there we have it. As a student, I don't think this would be the best way to learn how to implement a binary search, but I think this would be a really quick and easy way if you are trying to implement it on your own and you just need a way of quickly verifying whether what you have is on the right track. Then you can simply just go down somewhere at the bottom or in a different file, you can just do a comment and just take a look without having to go on to Google or Stack Overflow to search through the many results. Now let's try a different example. Let's try something where we are using a framework. So let's say I'm using React. So JavaScript, React. And I think an important note to point out here is that sometimes as testers of Copilot, we might be testing with things that we are already familiar with. But let's say if you're new to this framework, let's say you're a beginner to React, then how might someone actually use Copilot to learn React in a more efficient way? So let's say I'm a beginner and I want to just create a simple counter. So I might do something like create a React component of a counter, and let's see what we get. And then I might do Control Enter and see I might want to import React and export a counter class. Where did it go? Let's scroll. And you can see that some of the suggestions will be a bit outdated using this and using super. So as a beginner, you might not know what are the trends or what are the best practices. And because Copilot is being trained on data from over the past few years, it's not going to be that familiar with what are the recent changes and developments in the framework itself. So while you could go with this solution over here, a more experienced developer might want to scroll ahead and see what are more appropriate suggestions. And it turns out there isn't that many great suggestions, but we could always just go with the first one over here, and assuming we're a beginner, we might go with this. So it's a really quick and dirty way to get started using a framework. But it might not necessarily be the best way to do this. I think it's still helpful to take a look at the documentation and look at recent examples of what people are actually doing so that you don't actually end up learning the wrong thing by looking at the suggestions, which may not always be what you want. Now let's say we want to dive a bit deeper and try out a library within this framework. So let's say I want to create an uploader function within this file. So let's go ahead and delete all of this and say we want to do a simple template over here and just call this uploader. And over here, I want to return a component, an uploader component which uploads the file to a server. Let's go with this. And then rather than having to do tab enter, let's just do Control Enter and see what we get. We return a div button, we get a simple form. But if let's say I want to use a library, let's say I want to upload a component using, if I already know the library I want, I can say React Drop Zone Uploader. Let's see whether it knows about this library. So I can do Control Enter and see what do we have. We actually have solutions implemented using the class name Drop Zone. So what I was actually looking for was this component or this library over here, React Drop Zone Uploader, that you would have some code like this. But because there's not enough context in this file, so Copilot is not able to generate that accurate suggestions. And then once you're done with the suggestions, you can go ahead and close the tab over here. And let's go ahead and create a new file here. This time, let's try something that's got to do with a cloud service. So let's say I'm working with Python, and let's say I want to upload my file from a Flask app into my Amazon S3 bucket. So let's say I want to upload a file from Flask app. Or rather, let's say, let's go with Flask app to my Amazon S3 bucket. Let's see what we get. We get another comment, but if I type def, define a function, let's see what we get. We get a suggestion. So upload file to S3, we get S3 upload file object. And these are actually the parameters that we will need, and it actually looks pretty good. The only thing we need to actually specify is the S3 over here, which is not defined, as well as the config over here. And so that's pretty much half the work that's been done for you, and all you need to do is figure out how to set up S3 and your configuration over here. So honestly, I think it's been pretty helpful and useful so far, because this allows you to really focus on writing better code and not having to scroll through tons of documentation looking for the parameters, the options that you need to include. So that's really great. Now that you've seen a demo of how Copilot is like, let's try to answer some of the questions that you might be having when seeing Copilot in action for the first time. You might be wondering, how does this all work underneath the hood? And so it turns out that the Copilot editor extension basically sends the comments and code that you type in your editor to the GitHub Copilot service, which then uses this system called OpenAI Codex, which is just a new AI system created by OpenAI to synthesize and generate individual lines and even whole functions. But then the next question will be, how does it actually generate these suggestions? And as you can see at the bottom, this model is actually being trained on public code and text on the internet. So there are two parts here. The first part is the code, which is probably from Stack Overflow or GitHub. and the text, which is just any natural language that you see online. And so that will explain why Copilot is able to understand both programming and human languages. A question related to this is, what context does Copilot use to generate these suggestions? So as I mentioned before, Copilot uses the current file as the context when making its suggestions. And this means that it does not yet use other files in your project as inputs. So any other files in your project are not being considered except for the one that you're currently working on. The implication of this is that sometimes it might help to copy and paste a certain type declaration or some piece of code that you think might help with providing the context to improve suggestions from Copilot. The next question then will be, can or will GitHub Copilot help me write code for a new platform? So if you've seen an example where I work with React, it's not clear that Copilot will always suggest you useful or helpful suggestions. And although React is not exactly a very new platform or API, but there has been some major changes to how people write React code, and as such there has been very little public code available that uses React in the way that people do nowadays, and so the model is unlikely to generate code that's very useful without fine-tuning. And so Copilot is still a work in progress, and in the future they do plan to provide ways to highlight newer APIs and samples to raise their relevance in GitHub Copilot suggestions. And so the question would be, how will GitHub Copilot get better over time? The answer here actually doesn't really answer the question, but what they're saying is basically that GitHub Copilot doesn't actually test the code it suggests, so the code may not even compile or run. And so ultimately it's up to the programmer to check and verify that the program runs the way they expect it to. And although they say that Copilot is able to understand the context within one file, Copilot can only in fact hold a very limited context, which means that files which are longer than a few hundred lines are going to be clipped, and only the immediately preceding context is going to be used. Besides that, Copilot may even suggest old or deprecated uses of libraries and languages, which you have seen in the example with React, and so it really emphasizes the point that the programmer has to check on the code and make sure that what's being suggested is efficient and effective. Essentially, I believe these are the issues that GitHub will be focusing on addressing in future, but to actually answer the question, I would say that one way they're doing this is whenever you accept suggestions by Copilot, these choices are actually being treated as data to be used to improve on the existing Copilot model. And so it's sort of like a feedback loop that's going on. And so this leads to the next question, does GitHub Copilot write perfect code? And of course the answer is no, but it does try its best to understand your intent and to generate the best code it can. And they also mentioned that as the developer, you are always in charge, and it's your responsibility to make sure that the code works well and you're not over relying on Copilot, because after all, it is a Copilot and it's not the main pilot, which is yourself, the developer. How good is GitHub Copilot then? According to their benchmarking, the model is about 43% accurate on the first time, but that number jumps to about 57% when the model is allowed up to 10 attempts. Given this sort of accuracy then, how can you get the most out of GitHub Copilot? The answer to that is just to divide your code into small functions, use meaningful names, and write good doc strings and comments as you go. And that really takes a bit of practicing to be able to type out what you actually want in your function or your program. Now on to protecting originality. Does GitHub Copilot recite code from the training set? An important note to make here is that GitHub Copilot is not a search engine, it's a code synthesizer, so it's actually generating these suggestions. And so naturally you'll see that very rarely, about 0.1% of the time, the suggestion may actually contain snippets that are copied wholesale from the training set. Most of the time this happens when you don't provide sufficient context, such as when you're editing an empty file, which was the examples that you saw previously, or when there is a common solution to the problem. More importantly though, who actually owns the code that Copilot generates? It's you, the developer. Copilot is simply a tool that generates code snippets, and ultimately it's the user that has to be responsible for the output that's being generated and making sure to make the changes that are necessary to tweak these suggestions to what they actually want. Another question is whether Copilot ever outputs personal data. The fact of the matter is that since Copilot was trained on publicly available code, then naturally it is possible that Copilot suggestions will include personal data verbatim from the training set. So you might have seen the previous example, an API key, but that's only what it looks like on the surface. It is actually made up of information synthesized from patterns in training data. And in fact, for any emails that are being shown in the technical preview, GitHub has implemented a rudimentary filter that will block emails shown in standard formats. That said, it's still possible to get the model to suggest this sort of content if you do try hard enough. Now, can GitHub Copilot introduce insecure code in its suggestions? Again, looking at the data that Copilot was trained on, it makes sense that it is possible for Copilot to suggest insecure code. And it is something that GitHub is concerned about, and so they've been working a lot on dependabot actions and code QL to improve code quality. But again, we as developers need to exercise some judgment to evaluate and decide whether the code is secure or not. Also related to responsible AI is the question of whether tools like Copilot will affect developer jobs. And the answer provided by GitHub is that they expect this technology to enable existing engineers to be more productive, reducing the amount of manual work that they have to do, and at the same time the hope is that Copilot will lower the barriers to entry for more people that are trying to explore software development and join the next generation of developers. Personally, I think that at the current stage, Copilot is not sufficient enough to replace developers, but it will definitely help existing developers to do what they do in a more efficient manner. And at the same time, it's quite an enabling tool that will allow basically anyone to be able to try their hand at software development. You might also be having some questions about telemetry, which is basically the automatic recording and transmission of data from remote sources to an IT system for monitoring and analysis. As I mentioned before, in order to generate suggestions, Copilot actually transmits part of the file you're editing to the GitHub Copilot service, and it will also record whether the suggestions are accepted or rejected in order to improve future suggestions for all users. And the question then is whether the transmitted data is secure. GitHub says that yes, it's secure, and access to the telemetry is strictly limited to individuals on a need-to-know basis. And here they also say that inspection of the gathered source code will be mostly automatic, which means that there will be times when humans will read the gathered source code, but when that happens, that's going to be, or at least hopefully going to be, specifically with the aim of improving the model or detecting abuse. Last but not least, on the availability of Copilot. Why is this technical preview restricted and not being rolled out to the public? Part of the reason might be hardware limitations, but also I think what they're trying to do is to get feedback from a limited number of testers who will be able to provide them insights into how to improve on this product, and eventually they would plan to launch a commercial product which would then be made available as broadly as possible. And so if you're wondering whether there will be a paid version, pretty much very likely. If the technical preview is successful, we will most likely see a commercial version of GitHub Copilot. This current preview, where it's available to some users for free, is mainly just to learn about how people might use GitHub Copilot and what it takes to operate it at scale. And naturally then, if you look at the bigger picture, having Copilot as a VS Code extension is just one of the possible use cases of this AI model. Although the focus now is just to deliver the best experience in VS Code, the vision is that OpenAI Codex will be used by developers to build even more powerful apps in future. So overall, Copilot and OpenAI Codex is really exciting, and I would love to see the developments and improvements that will be made in future. That's all I have for this video. If you found it useful, please give it a like and share it with anyone who's not heard about this amazing new tool by GitHub. Also do consider subscribing if you'd like to see more such videos. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.